Welcome. You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast, the show that cuts through the fog of war and updates you about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
Hello, I'm Marina Yevshan, your host of the Russia-Ukraine War Report podcast, and today is October the 2nd, 2024. It has been 3,901 days since Russia started covert military operations in Crimea, 10 years and 224 days since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, 2 years and 221 days since Russia expanded its war of aggression, and 58 days since Ukraine counter-invaded Russia. Today's podcast covers the events that happened on Tuesday and Wednesday morning. Our Russia-Ukraine war map is a great companion to the podcast, and there is a link in the podcast description. There are map updates today. The Russia-Ukraine War Report is compiled by our team from around the world. Today's report includes information from our direct contacts and journalists in Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine morning reports, operational commands north, south and east of Ukraine, open source intelligence, our in-house team of analysts and geospatial experts, and pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian mail bloggers and social media channels with a track record of trying to be accurate. We have one mission, the truth, because the truth matters. Here is my daily assessment. 1. We continue to remain unsure if the current operational tempo is a new normal, or if Moscow is attempting to advance as far as possible before fall weather arrives. We maintain that the current operational tempo is unsustainable, and at some point Russian combat operations have to decline. 2. The capture of Vuhledar by Russian troops represents the second operational objective achieved by Moscow in 2024. 3. Continued nuclear threats from Moscow highlight how the world remains caught in the mutually assured destruction instability paradox. 4. The lack of a meaningful response by Ukraine's allies and international organizations to open and unrestricted attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russia has convinced Moscow this is an effective strategy with no political consequences. 5. Russia will maintain its attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, continuing Russian crimes against humanity that started in October 2022, as outlined in 4 arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. The continued attacks are increasing the probability of a nuclear accident at one or more of Ukraine's nuclear power plants due to a loss of external power connections. 6. The policy of escalation management implemented by the NATO alliance and the United States is a complete failure that has only encouraged Russia to escalate hybrid and kinetic warfare actions against the NATO alliance and Ukraine's allies and their economic interests. 7. We maintain that autocrat Vladimir Putin's order to recapture the Kursk region of Russia by October the 15th is unrealistic and highly unlikely. 8. We maintain it is highly unlikely that Russian forces will capture Toretsk, New York, Mirnograd, Pokrovsk and Selidove by October the 15th. 9. The Russian economy is much weaker than reported. 10. We maintain there could be a shift in Washington's policy toward Ukraine's request for deep strikes within Russia after the November the 5th national elections. Yesterday, Russia carried out 155 discrete assaults, and through October the 2nd, the 7-day moving average for daily attacks was unchanged at 174. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, or GSAFU, reported the VKS, that's the Russian Aerospace Forces, carried out 68 airstrikes, dropping 124 bombs, and ground forces carried out over 3,800 fire missions. This is a significant drop from a week ago, when Russia was carrying out over 5,000 fire missions per day, and suggests that ammunition shortages due to recent Ukrainian attacks are intensifying. In the Kursk region, Ukraine controls 1,023.5 square kilometers, with another 258.5 in the gray zone, for a total area of 1,282 square kilometers. Most of the changes were due to uncertainty about territorial control in the Plekhovo area and a small change in territorial control west of Krasnooktyabrsk. There are 2 bridges. The first, from Nikolaevo-Daryino to Kucherov, is 59.5 kilometers wide, and the second, at Novy Put, is 20 kilometers. Ukrainian forces are up to 26 kilometers in depth from the main bridge at Sudzha and up to 6.4 kilometers deep from the second bridge at Novy Put. Our analysts have been tracking the equipment losses of Russia and Ukraine, but have wondered how many non-military vehicles Russian troops are using in assaults and for frontline operations. Now we know. Using publicly available data from analyst Andrew Perpetua, Russia is increasingly reliant on the UAZ-452 Loaf in frontline operations, including assaults, which artificially inflates the ratio of Ukrainian versus Russian losses. Ukraine has a deep supply of infantry mobility vehicles and mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, while Russian military doctrine doesn't prioritize protecting dismounts and crew. Combat losses of Russian Loafs have exploded since July 2023. In August of the same year, approximately 25 of the civilian delivery vans were destroyed or damaged in combat. A year later, the number was exponentially higher, approximately 215. And last month, the number was over 200 again. The UAZ-452 Loaf, nicknamed in the West the Scooby Doo van, is a rugged and flexible vehicle, but it is a civilian vehicle with large non-ballistic windows and no armor. The key difference is that Ukrainian troops in a purpose-built infantry mobility vehicle will likely walk away from running over a mine or from a drone strike. The armor and ballistic glass also protect the dismounts and crew from shrapnel. Their Russian counterparts have a much lower survival rate. In an attritional war, equipment is critical but still secondary. The most precious resource the armed forces of Ukraine has is the individual combat soldier. On the battlefield, it was another day of high operational tempo with little change. It's time to go into the details of the most important events over the last 24 hours. Ready? Here we go. The Ukrainian counter-invasion of Russia enters its 58th day, and the last 24 hours were unusually quiet. Russian sources reported fighting continued in the areas of Veselaya and Novy Put. For the third day in a row, NASA Fire Information for Resource Management Systems suggested that fighting had moved northwest of Veselaya in the direction of Sukhinovka. We reduced the area under Ukrainian control west of Krasnooktябрьsky after new intelligence indicated that Russian forces occupied the tree line on the western edge of the village. Continued fighting was reported in the area of Lyubimovka and west of Nikolaevo-Dar'ina. Russian forces shelled and the VKS carried out airstrikes on Olgovka and Dar'ina. The Russian Ministry of Defense, or Armed, claimed fighting continued in the area of Plekhovo. Russia is slowly destroying the occupied city of Sudzha, despite hundreds of civilians remaining in the settlement that was home to 5,000. British journalist Jamie Rushton reported in The Guardian. Quote, "And while the Ukrainian forces took Sudzha relatively intact, Russian strikes are now slowly leveling it." A Ukrainian military intelligence escort told Rushton, quote, "2 weeks ago it was quiet. Now they're hitting the town with artillery, drones and glide bombs." Moscow seems to be proud of its attacks on civilian areas, reporting today that the villages of Bogdanovka and Mirny on the edge of Sudzha were shelled and bombed by the VKS. GSAFU reported that Russia carried out 15 airstrikes on Ukrainian-occupied Kursk Oblast using 20 precision-guided bombs. Ukrainian forces released pictures showing that a command post for the Russian 234th Guards Air Assault, that's the VDV, regiment, was captured in the Kursk region. The 234th was assigned to the Orikhiv operational area in the Zaporizhia region in Ukraine and was recently transferred to the Glushkovsky district. Finally, in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine, the VKS bombed the Esmany area, killing a 45-year-old woman and wounding her 47-year-old husband. Here is what's happening in my home of Ukraine. Despite carrying out 155 attacks along the line of conflict in Ukraine, Russian forces only made limited but tactically significant advances. Near Siversk, Ukrainian forces attacked a Russian trench line north of Spirne. Based on the new intelligence, the map was adjusted, showing a small Russian advance. Russian forces took control of Mykolaiivka and are now just 2,000 meters southeast of Mirnograd. During the Russian advance, 16 Ukrainian soldiers were encircled, surrendered, and were executed. Later in today's podcast, I'll explain more in the War Crimes and Human Rights section. The heaviest fighting was south of Selidove and west of Ukrainsk, where Russian forces continued to rapidly advance. Russian troops were geolocated at the mine complex south of Tsukurine, which I told you about last week, and how it is critical for the defense of Hirnik. At the time of recording, fighting was ongoing in Tsukurine. After 25 months of fighting, Russian forces captured the stronghold of Vuhledar. Due to its location, the construction of its buildings and the terrain, Vuhledar rose from the Ukrainian steppe like a fortress city from a 1970s science fiction movie, a cluster of Soviet-style concrete apartment buildings rising from the flat open fields that surrounded it. The first major ground attack on the mining community was in October 2022, when the Russian 155th Guards Naval Infantry attacked Pavlivka, capturing approximately 90% of the village before becoming combat destroyed. In the late January 2023, a 10-day armored assault resulted in the loss of 137 tanks and other vehicles, making it the largest offensive loss for Russian forces since the failed Belogorivka river crossing on May 8, 2022. Russia would carry out several other large-scale armored assaults through the rest of 2023 and into the spring of 2024, gaining no new territory and losing over 200 more armored vehicles. When Russian troops captured Kostiantynivka over the summer, severing the T-532 highway, the loss of Vuhledar became a certainty. The capture is the second operational goal completed by Moscow in 2024, the other being the February capture of Avdiivka. Due to changes on the battlefield, Vuhledar is not as strategically important as it was in 2023, mostly because of the loss of control of the T-532 highway, Kostiantynivka and Novomykhailivka. The larger impact is the Russian military lost thousands of soldiers, broke the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, and had hundreds of armored vehicles destroyed. Vuhledar will no longer serve as a fortress that stood for 31 months, causing losses that almost any other modern military would consider unacceptable. In all that war strategy talk, I don't want some humane things to be lost. Let's take a moment and think about civilians forced to abandon their homes, and about warriors defending their land and crippling the enemy for so long. Keeping with tradition, Russian forces tried to advance further, meeting fierce resistance. A BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle was abandoned and recovered by Ukrainian forces. Russian drones attacked the civilian port of Izmail in the Odessa region, targeting the Romanian-Ukrainian border infrastructure. Trucks carrying grain were destroyed in the attack, with 2 drivers wounded, including a Turkish citizen. At the time of publication, neither Romania nor Turkey had released a statement.
You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War Podcast. Our team of journalists, researchers, and analysts is funded by readers, listeners, and viewers just like you. To support independent journalism, please consider becoming a patron. You can find us on patreon.com/malcontentnews.
Here is today's Theaterwide update. Responding to a report in the Financial Times, the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Andriy Sybiha, denied that Kyiv was considering any peace negotiations that would require the transfer of any territory to Russia. Sybiha called for, quote, full accountability for Russia and the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, including Crimea, adding that any peace deal that offers territorial compromise, quote, will be a delayed war. New French Prime Minister Michel Barnier said that supporting Ukraine will be a priority for Paris during a policy speech to the National Assembly. Quote, These are people who, for 2.5 years since the beginning of the war of aggression, have been fighting and dying to defend their freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We must understand that they are fighting to defend the values that we also share with them. In an opening speech, the new Council of Europe's Secretary-General Alain Berset emphasized Ukraine, democracy, and unity as priorities for its work. During his evening address, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky said that in the first half of 2024, quote, Ukraine has produced 25 times more artillery and mortar ammunition than in the whole of 2022. The total number of drones we are now capable of producing annually in Ukraine is 4 million, and over 1.5 million have already been ordered. The biggest barrier to increasing drone production is funds to buy materials and pay workers. Speaking on Marathon, Ivan Havrilyuk, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, said that, quote, the ratio of artillery ammunition usage on the battlefield has decreased compared to winter 2024, when the ratio was 1:8. As of today, it stands at 1:3. Havrilyuk added this was part of a comprehensive effort to establish joint ventures so that, quote, with the help of our partners, we have the capability to produce the entire range of weapons and military equipment that we need. Ukrainian forces have started to booby-trap electronics such as tablets, smartphones and computers, leaving them behind in abandoned positions. Reportedly, dozens of Russian troops have been injured from handling the mined devices. They hold a small charge, just 10 to 15 grams of explosives, which are attached to the battery, making them nearly impossible to detect. A remote control signal, a timer, or rough handling can detonate the charge. The new Secretary-General of the NATO alliance, former Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte, said that he saw no direct risk associated with Russian threats to use nuclear weapons, and called them, quote, careless and irresponsible. Rutte warned that continued appeasement to Moscow is setting a terrible precedent and, quote, there is no immediate threat of nuclear weapons being used. The Romanian parliament has approved a proposal by President Klaus Iohannis to establish a joint training base for Ukrainian naval infantry personnel. Under the proposed plan, the facility will operate for 2 years, with Romania reserving the right to terminate its commitments at any point during the training process or after the designated period ends. Our War Crimes and Human Rights section can cover difficult topics, including torture, gender-based violence, war crimes, and violence against children. Today's report contains mildly graphic details about war crimes. A drone recorded Russian troops lining up 16 Ukrainian prisoners of war in the frontline village of Mykolaiivka. The infrared camera video showed the captured Ukrainian troops forced to stand in a line on the edge of a forest strip and then executed by 4 Russian soldiers firing machine guns. One soldier then approaches the bodies and fires into them for a second time at point-blank range. It is the largest single verifiable extrajudicial execution of Ukrainian prisoners since February 2022. The Donetsk Oblast Regional Prosecutor's Office has opened a pre-trial investigation into the violation of the laws and customs of war, combined with intentional murder. The Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Dmytro Lubinets, wrote on Twitter, also known as X, quote, the inhumane country violated IHL and the Geneva Conventions once again. Systematic crimes against Ukrainian prisoners of war must be stopped. Russian shelling of the Nikopol district of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast disabled the 330 kV power connection to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, forcing the facility to rely on a single 750 kV connection for external power. Energy Minister Herman Halushchenko said that this latest act of Russian terrorism had created a threat of an accident at the occupied ZNPP. In the city of Kherson, Russia attacked an outside market where local growers gathered to sell fruit and vegetables. The strike killed 7 and wounded 5, mostly pensioners either seeking food for purchase or trying to supplement their income. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on Twitter, quote, We must achieve lasting peace for our state and our people. For this to happen, Ukrainian strength and the resolve of our partners must outweigh Putin's desire to wreak terror. The VKS used Fab-500T glide bombs to attack the city of Zaporizhia, striking a 14-floor apartment building. 1 person was killed and 32 wounded, including 3 children. We close out today's podcast once again in the lands of Mobiks, Mobilization and Mir. The lower house of the State Duma has passed a bill that would enable the Russian Ministry of Defense to mobilize over 20,000 defendants currently facing criminal charges, but who have not gone to trial. The Russian opposition news agency Important Stories reported that although the law has not yet been signed by autocrat Vladimir Putin, Russian pretrial detention centers have already begun preparations to release defendants to fight in the war. Currently, there are 60,000 people in pretrial detention, and Armad concluded that up to 40% can be pressed into military service. 2 Chinese nationals who fought for Russia under the aliases of Kola and Sprite were killed in action in Ukraine. Russian male blogger Yegor Guzenko, better known as 13th, joined a growing number of sources reporting that shell starvation has started among Russian units, both small arms and large-caliber ammunition. Quote, "This is not happening locally, it is now being felt in various directions. I mean, go ahead storming, but without artillery fire. It shouldn't be like that." We have noted a significant increase in the number of Russian offensive, including in Vovchansk near Peshchane and in the direction of Kurakhove, which lacked artillery support, contributing to the failure of the attacks. Guzenko would not fully attribute the shortages to Ukrainian attacks on ammunition depots, instead implying that the Russian Ministry of Defense wasn't being fair with distribution. Quote, "This is all very bad, of course, but the factories work. Where are these munitions going? Why are there not enough of them for the troops?" And that's what we know. Your support of my home, Ukraine, helps us make history and protect the future for all.
You've been listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast. To help keep us independent, please consider providing financial support by becoming a patron. Want on-demand news in your hand? Download the Google News app and make Malcontent News one of your favorites to receive breaking news updates. Thank you for listening.